Okay. All right.
All right, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for being here this afternoon. For those watching online, thanks as we come together. Professor Bjorkman, come to order. Glad to be here with all of you as we get our Fall 2024 event series started at the Center for Asian Democracy. My name is David Buckley. I'm Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, Religion here in the Department of Political Science and also Director of CAD. We are especially grateful today, as always, to staff Emily Rasmussen and Sheriff for their help in bringing us together. And in a special way, I want to acknowledge Anthony Humley, who has done a lot of work over the summer to improve the quality of the live stream. So thanks very much, Anthony. And as always, for any who are online, we'll be monitoring Q&A that way, but also this will allow us to have a better archive for the future so that these lectures can be accessed by others online. The fall series is getting started today with a visit of Professor Richard Eaton from the University of Arizona. I'll just briefly introduce Dick, and then we'll turn things over to him. Richard Eaton is one of the most distinguished historians of South Asia today. He recently served as South Asia Center Visiting Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. He's done other visiting fellowships at universities across the world, across his career. Eaton's primary scholarly interest is the social and cultural history of pre-modern India. Most recently, he published the second volume of the New Penguin History of India, entitled India in the Persianate Age, 1000 through 1765, which explores the long-term interaction between Persianate and Sanskritic worlds between the Iranian plateau and South Asia, and between Islam and Indian religious traditions. He's published extensively scholarly monographs, articles, and public-facing pieces regarding pluralism and historical dynamics in India and across South Asia. He is the author of one of his books, Temple Desecration and Indo-Muslim States in India in the Persianate Age, 1000 through 1765, and that work on the political role of temples, both historically and in the contemporary period, will be at the center of what Professor Eaton talks about with us today. As many of you know, Hindu temples feature prominently in today's Indian politics, probably most visibly in Prime Minister Narendra Modi's consecration and patronage of the Rama Temple in Ayodhya. Professor Eaton will highlight how the pre-colonial and colonial past helps us to illuminate contemporary dynamics, and how the ghosts of historical periods inform. So join me in welcoming Professor Richard Eaton.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thank you all for coming. It's a great delight to be here in Louisville. I've only had the pleasure of being here once before, and that was just driving through. So I'm really happy to spend a little more time this time. So the talk I want to give today is building on some work I've done over the years. I've had a growing interest in the politics of temples and mosques in South Asia, and with a particular view of connecting the past with both the deeper past and the past with the present, which is what I think historians are doing when they're being proper historians. So what I want to do today is to try to connect, as I said, the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the contemporary worlds. So looking through the axis of political theology. And I'll start with the point. Well, let me just start these slides. These three moments. The pre-colonial one, I'm going to go way back to the beginning of the 6th century, and it really divides into two moments within this pre-colonial. I want to talk about the 5th to the 12th, 5th to the 13th, and 13th down to the late 18th century, with a view to thinking about the political status of temples as they evolved from the 6th century on. In the long sweep of pre-colonial history, state authorities, whether they were Hindus or Muslims, left India's thousands of ordinary temples alone simply because they were politically irrelevant. But royal temples, elaborately endowed situated in the heart of a sovereign realm, occupied a very different status. They housed the image of the state's divine overlord, and therefore were above all sites where Indian kingship was established, reconfirmed, or contested. And as such, royal temples were always subject to attack by state enemies, regardless of their religion. And the point I want to make here, this runs through the whole talk, is that in medieval thought, and continuing down to the present, there was never any clear line between politics and religion, or between a temple's political status and its religious status. They're really blurred, and they overlap. Therefore, desecration of royal temples was a normal means of detaching a defeated enemy from the most prominent manifestation of his former sovereign authority. Doing so would leave him politically impotent. Similarly, under Muslim rulers, any temple was considered liable for desecration if its patron rebelled after having already or earlier submitted to state authority. For everyone well understood how Indians had blurred a temple's religious status with its political status. So, desecration is one of several ways in which temples were treated by political authorities, but it's only one of 4 or 5 that I want to talk about in the pre-colonial period. It's the first of them, though. And I'm going to talk about this earlier pre-Turkish, pre-Muslim moment, especially this long period from the 6th century to the 12th century is one in which you have very powerful Hindu Maharajas in dynasties which are named here on this map. And they were contesting against each other, and their temples, royal temples, were attacked by enemies. For example, this image was seized from the Chalukya enemy. The Chalukyas were this power in the central Deccan Plateau you see here, by the Cholas, who were down in the Tamil country to the southeast. It was seized in 1045, and they even had an inscription at the base of this icon, boasting of the fact that they had taken it from the Chalukya capital at Kalyana and taken it to their own capital after having burned the capital. Same thing happened with another image taken from the Chalukyas, again by the Chola dynasty, and taken to their capital. This was very common. In fact, here is a statement made by the emperor of the Chalukyas himself, Someshwara III. The enemy's capital city should be burned, the palace of the king, beautiful buildings, palaces of princes, ministers of high-ranking officers, temples, streets with shops, horse and elephant stables, all of it. So this was a normative and normal policy of destroying temples of royal enemies. Another such case where the Cholas went all the way to Bengal and seized this Shiva image and took it back to their capital in South Arakat. So that precedent precedes the coming of Muslim Turks. The Delhi Sultanate is established in the early 13th century, taking over as you see in the map, the Indus Valley, the Gangetic Plain. Later on, in the 14th century, the Sultanate expanded clear into the Deccan Plateau over much of South Asia, as you see. And what I did in my own research in reconstructing the politics of temple desecration, I actually looked at the epigraphic record, inscriptions, to find out what temples were destroyed, by whom, under what political circumstance, when, and where. What you find is a very clear pattern. As the first dynasty of Turks conquered North India, they swept from the northwest to the southeast, and the numbers attached to each of these temples relate to the chronology. So number 1 would be actually Ajmer in the far northwest, and you move straight on down into Bengal in the early 13th century. And the rulers were very clear about the source of their power. The earliest coins actually depict an image of a horseman with either a mace or, in this case, a bow that's strapped to the saddle, just in case you couldn't read the Arabic, which in this case is the Muslim confession of faith, the source of their power is very clear. After having conquered the Gangetic Plain, the next goal was to reach the Arabian Sea. So you have the early Delhi Sultanate expands to the southwest into Gujarat. That also is accompanied by destruction of royal temples. And then from there, deeper into the Deccan, and then finally down to the tip of the peninsula. And what's interesting, this is just one example. Warangal happened to be the capital of one of these dynasties that was confronted by Turkish arms in this case, the early 14th century. Warangal, and when it was attacked by Ulugh Khan, who would be the future Muhammad bin Tughlaq, Sultan of Delhi, it was completely leveled. You see here the ruins of the temple, but you also see these magnificent toranas or gateways were built around the cardinal directions. Now here's what it looks like today. I mean, all you see is the outline here of the original temple. The red is completely missing. The other is, you can tell by the markings of where the foundation of the original temple had been. But what's preserved are these four magnificent gateways, which the workers used to frame the building of a mosque in place of this temple in the middle of the plaza. So this had been where the Swayambhu Shiva, who was the particular overlord of the Kakatiya dynasty, the great temple had been located, and it was completely leveled. Here's one of those toranas, and here's the central. What you see is the remains of that mosque on the right, but in the background you can see one of those surviving gateways, which was preserved. So that's the pattern. This continues. We move into the 14th century and the 15th century, when there are rebellions against Delhi, or when there are new former provinces of the Delhi Sultanate which established their own independence, as happened in Kashmir and Rajasthan, Plateau. They had their own uprising to deal with, and again, there's a pattern of temple desecration. When the Mughals come, which you see here in this map taking us into the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, it's pretty calm until there are rebellions against Mughal authority, mainly in the 17th century and 18th century. And at this time, these rebellions take place in two prominent places: the Deccan and Rajasthan. The point here being, again, the idea that any ruler who had submitted to Mughal authority, but then subsequently rebelled against it, if that ruler was patronizing a temple, then both he and the temple were liable for punishment. Now, those were the exceptions. In the vast majority of cases, hundreds of thousands of temples were left untouched by both Hindus and Muslims because they had no political significance. For example, going back to the North Indian plain, when the Turks swept down that plain toward Bengal, they simply bypassed the temples that were no longer actively justifying or legitimizing an existing enemy state. So, for example, here we have in Khajuraho the capital of the Chandala, or in this previous slide here, right on the pathway of those armies as they move toward Bengal. And the reason it's untouched is because it was out of business. The light is like a light bulb which suddenly loses electricity. It's worthless. The same thing happens in the Deccan. When Ulugh Khan, I just mentioned him as destroying the great Swayambhu Shiva temple, he went right by. 2 miles from that temple is the former capital of the former temple of the Kakatiya dynasty, which had been abandoned around 1200. And because it had been abandoned, it was left untouched by the army that destroyed the Kakatiya Swayambhu Shiva temple. So, another response was patronage. And was fascinating is that the Muslims were just as prepared to patronize temples as anyone else was. Here's again Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Permission to build a temple in a Muslim country can be accorded only to those who pay the jizya, the poll tax. If you agree to pay it, permission for building a new temple can be given. As for existing temples, ancient temples, here's a quote by one of the jurists advising the Sultan, Sikandar Lodi, that it would be unlawful to lay waste ancient idol temples. So temples were understood as basically state property in territory that had been conquered by one of these dynasties. And as state property, they were understood to be protected. It was the job of the state to protect temples. Here we have this extraordinary inscription, Sanskrit, mind you, issued in 1326, just 3 years after Ulugh Khan had swept through the Deccan Plateau and destroyed that great Swayambhu Shiva temple, the capital of the Kakatiya dynasty. 3 years after that, now we find him doing the opposite. He's supporting the reconstruction of a temple that had been damaged, and we have it in classic inscription, Sanskrit inscription style, with the sun and the moon motifs in the upper portion. The Sultan himself is described as the Maharaja Dhiraja Shri Suratana, the great king of kings, the prosperous Sultan, using Sanskrit formula for the king of kings. And even the governor who presided over the reconstruction of this temple under Muslim authority was given the Sanskrit title, the Mahapradhana. And again, that was the same person who 3 years earlier, as a general, had destroyed this temple. So it's all about context. In the context of, if you're in the path of an advancing army and you're resisting the state, then your temple gets destroyed. If we've already absorbed your territory into our state, then your temples get protected, or in the case you just saw, restored to proper worship. When we come to the Mughal period, the Emperor Akbar allowed many of his higher nobles, Hindu nobles, in this case Rajputs, to build their own temples under Mughal authority. So here in Vrindavan, the Govinda Deva temple that was built actually by Man Singh, a very high-ranking. His status in the empire was as high as the prince of the family, the royal family, the Mughal dynasty. And so this is a temple dedicated to the Govinda Deva temple. And if we step back a little bit and look at the architecture, which is fascinating, we can see that in the upper portion, we have traditional classic Persianate architecture style. But in the lower portion, we have Trabeate style, the typical associated with classical temple architecture. So the point is that while patronizing a Hindu temple, you're also incorporating the Mughal Persianate aesthetic. Indeed, both aesthetics are incorporated in this case. It's fascinating to see this. Another response is reuse. And material gets reused all the time in Indian architecture, beginning from the very start of Turkish rule in the north. Here's, of course, the great Qutub Minar, one of the most iconic structures of all Indian history, for that matter. The tallest minaret in the world when it was built in the late 12th century. But it was built largely out of reused temple. We don't know, but it's very likely that these temples had been destroyed during the conquest, because this, after all, was enemy territory, which certainly resisted the advance of Turks. But what they did is they took temple columns, stacked them end on end to gain double height. So the height would be double that of the original temple, Hindu temple. So that's one kind of reuse. But this was nothing confined to the Muslims. Here again, we go back to the Chalukya Empire, which is a very important empire that expanded across the entire midsection of the Deccan Plateau. Renowned for its own spectacular columns, very highly polished columns of the type you see here. This one dates back to the mid-11th century. But if you just focus on what I've highlighted on the left, you can see how that style would become imitated by subsequent dynasties long after the Chalukya were out of business. Both Hindus and Muslim dynasties would incorporate these very columns into their own architecture because they wanted to become associated with the prestige of the Chalukya. So you see here, for example, Vijayanagara, as late as the 16th century in the south, was incorporating Chalukya columns at the street level of this mandapa, which is right adjacent to the great Shiva temple down the street. And what's interesting is that local basalt was used for the upper floor in kind of second-rate columns, which are not as visible. But on the lower floor, which is visible because you're on the ground, you want to show off the fact that these are Chalukya columns. So you can see on the left the columns that were reused in the 16th century, and you can compare that with the ones you saw earlier dating back to the 11th century. So even though there's 500 years space between them, you can see the pattern here of reuse for purposes of prestige. You want to be associated with the Chalukyas. But it wasn't just Hindu dynasties like Vijayanagara. When we come to 16th century, when we have Muslim states, sultanates in the northern Deccan, Bijapur, Ahmednagar, Golconda, and the others, here we have a city that was patronized by Bijapur, conquered by Bijapur, Adoni. They build a mosque in this very important hill fort in the 1530s. And if you go inside that mosque, which is today ruined, you see in the most prominent place of the mosque these Chalukya columns dating back to the 11th and 12th centuries. So this is a fascinating dimension of reuse, seems to me, of thinking about how prestige plays a role in this business. Redefinition is another way in which temples were dealt with. Famous case, everyone knows, the great Hagia Sophia in present-day Istanbul had been a church for 9 centuries before it was transformed into a mosque in the mid-15th century by the Ottomans. That pattern is found all over the place in South Asia as well. Just one example, again in the Deccan, is how, again, a Kakatiya temple, which you see in the lower half below the yellow line, was simply transformed into a mosque, much like Hagia Sophia Church in Constantinople, in 1323, not by Turks, but by a local convert to Islam, in fact, who was the governor of Bhutan. And he did it by simply adding these domes on top of the existing temple. And in the interior, he simply added a mihrab on the western end facing Mecca. Everything else is preserved exactly as it had been. So, to conclude this portion of the talk then, we find desecration, we find non-intervention being actually the most common means of relating to prior temples. Patronage, both of new or pre-existing temples, reuse, of course, and redefinition. So, choice, what happens, is really subject to a number of variables, which I don't have time to go into right now, but the larger point is that desecration was only one of a number of ways in which Muslim dynasties interacted with temples in India. Now, the colonial moment is interesting, and it too, I think, divides into two halves. The 1600 is when the British East India Company gets started. I'm using 1765 more or less arbitrarily as a time when we can move from a trading company into an imperial power, because that's the year when they acquire the revenue rights in Bengal. And from that, it would simply expand across the rest of India in the course of the next century. So in that earlier half, when the British come, they establish, for example, here in Madras, now Chennai. This is Fort St. George as it would have looked in around the 650s or so. And early Madras, very clear division between the British white town, and there you see the Fort St. George in the lower portion. The black town was called Black Town, is where the Indians were. And as it grew, weavers were brought in from the interior. It was more convenient to have the cloth manufactured right there near the trading center. And here we are moving down in time. And now you see the Fort St. George is still there, but the city has moved out. And what's most interesting is that temples are appearing all over the place, but they're not patronized by the British. They're actually patronized by Hindu merchants who have made lots of money in dealing with the East India Company and want to show off their wealth by displaying these temples all over what became modern Chennai. And here's what they look like. These are 19th century temples patronized by some of those merchants, and they used as their model going all the way back to the 12th century. Here's the famous Meenakshi Temple in Madurai, which is kind of one of the many earlier grand temples that were, actually at least, the model for these 19th century temples in Madras. Now, all this changes as we move from East India Company rule to formal rule after the rebellion of 1857. Things change dramatically. The English are almost driven out of India altogether. So Queen Victoria takes over the control in 1858. And until that time, for about 50 years before the rebellion, the British had been actively interfering with Indian culture. Christian missionaries had railed against what they viewed as the barbaric Hindu beliefs. But after 1857, they became very conservative, very hands-off policy toward Indian religion, and especially Indian temples. Yet, as Queen Victoria replaced the old company with direct British rule, the government gradually accumulated increasing authority over their colony. And one of their first acts upon assuming formal rule was to establish the Archaeological Survey of India. You see, only several years afterwards, the ASI in 1862. Now, in the beginning, the ASI was confined to simply documenting and assessing Indian monuments. But as British power grew, so did their intervention in these temples, gradually assuming more and more authority over India's monuments. Just at the same time, they were assuming more and more authority over India's population. In particular, from the 1870s, there was an urge to preserve and protect ancient temples, not just document them. Now we're going to protect them, which meant actively intervening in the fabric of the monuments, which they now identified as antiquities. And gradually, they came to see Indian temples as de facto museums. For the ultimate rationale for foreign rule over India was that the British were an enlightened government that was efficient and rational. But for this purpose, it followed that India had to be understood as having fallen from an earlier moment of greatness. So the ASI juxtaposed ancient grandeur, which they wished to conserve through the ASI, with the idea of modern Hinduism as corrupt and debased, which was a result of decades of missionary propaganda. This, in turn, led to the Ancient Monument Protection Act of 1904, which officially registered and categorized all major temples in India, just as the Indian census had already enumerated and categorized all the peoples of India. But here came the contradiction. How could de facto museums also function as living sites for public worship? After all, regular worship might alter those ancient temples in some way, and the ASI did not want anything to be changed. These are museums, in effect. To be sure, colonial attitudes towards some Muslim monuments differed from how they saw Hindu monuments. Because the British saw themselves as heirs to the Mughal Empire, which they had displaced in North India, they lavishly patronized Mughal imperial monuments like palaces and tombs, such as Humayun's tomb. And this especially happened when they moved the capital from Calcutta to Delhi in 1912, when they really appropriated the entire kind of aesthetic vision of the Mughals. And we see in their patronage of monuments such as Humayun's tomb. At the same time, ancient Hindu temples were extolled as representing what the British imagined was a pure, what they called Indo-Aryan architecture. A good example of that is the Lingaraj temple in Orissa, an 11th century structure. As the colonial art historian James Ferguson wrote in 1910, and I'm quoting him here, such temples had escaped the ravages that devastated the principal Hindu cities in the earlier and more intolerant age of Mohammedan power. So the British could both admire Mughal imperial culture, but revile Islamic religious culture. As Deborah Sutton has shown, the ASI's role in protecting sites like the Lingaraj temple here put the British in conflict with local Brahmin priests who claimed that they alone had the authority to maintain temples like this. So ultimately, this is taking us back to Indian understandings of sovereignty. That was where I began this talk. Because in classical Indian thought, the deity was sovereign over royal territory. It was the deity who was sovereign, while the Maharaja merely governed on behalf of that deity. But now that the territory, including the temple, was under colonial British rule, the British now could claim that they were the legitimate trustees of the god Lingaraj, and therefore they were the ones responsible for the upkeep of the temple. So in 1913, the British Commissioner of Orissa was made the guardian of 14 temples in the area of Bhubaneswar in Orissa, including this particular temple. So in this light, when the director of the ASI learned that worship had been allowed to continue in temples that had been included in the 1904 Act, he was appalled. After all, he exclaimed, if these temples were property, how could worship in them be revived? See, the British were worried that devotees might disconfigure the work of conservation that public funds have been used to maintain. Therefore, as government property, temples would be fenced, they'd be put under lock and key with a sign notifying that they were the property of the government and must not be used for religious purposes. So in this way, we can see that the government was essentially reaffirming an idea that had deep roots going back to the Sultanate, Mughal times, even pre-Muslim times, namely that religious monuments were state property and would be protected by the state. This would have profound consequences for modern India and for the current status of both temples and mosques. In particular, mosques that were built on sites of earlier temples, or at least those temples that were believed to have been built on such sites. And this then takes us to the modern period, or the post-colonial moment, from 1847 on. One such contested site is that of the Gyanvapi Mosque in Benares, or Varanasi. This mosque was built on the site of a great Shiva temple, the famous Vishwanath temple, which the Emperor Aurangzeb had destroyed in the year 1669. Now, the temple had been built in 1585 by a Hindu nobleman, acting again on the authority of the imperial Mughals. So here again we have this sub-imperial patronage going on. In this case, it was Jahangir. But things got complicated Akbar was the one who was the patron of that. But things got complicated in 1666 when at least one of those descendants of the Hindu patron who built the temple, was suspected of having assisted Shivaji, who was the Mughals' arch enemy, escape from imperial detention in Agra. It's also possible that landholders in Benares, who would later rebel against Mughal authority, had helped the fugitive Shivaji when he was passing through that region. So for such reasons, the emperor ordered the demolition of the temple. Years later, a queen rebuilt the temple beside the mosque. And for centuries, both communities shared the space. But today, many Hindus want to reclaim that part of the site on which the mosque was built. So here you see both the original Gyanvapi on the left and the Vishwanath Temple on the right. Just 3 years ago, 5 Hindu women wanted to worship what they believed were Hindu icons inside the mosque. Specifically, the dispute was over the status of an object that Muslims claim was a water fountain in the ablution pond of the mosque's courtyard, but which the women considered to be an icon representing Shiva. 2 years ago, a local court allowed a video survey to take place to investigate the matter, and just last year it allowed an archaeological survey to take place. So once again, we see the ASI intervening as though this were ultimately a matter of state property. A similar thing has happened in Mathura. In 1670, the same emperor, Aurangzeb, directed local officers to destroy another prominent temple, the Keshavadeva temple in Mathura, and to build an Islamic structure in its place, which is the Shahi Eidgah, which you see here. Like the Shiva temple in Benares, this temple had been built by a Hindu noble acting under the authority of the Mughal emperor, in this case 1618, under the authority of Jahangir. 40 years later, Jahangir's grandson, Aurangzeb, came to power after defeating his brother, Dara Shikoh, in a bitter, bloody civil war for the throne in 1658. But importantly, Dara Shikoh had himself patronized the Keshavadeva temple, including by building a stone railing around it. So, when Aurangzeb came to power, he not only executed his bitter enemy, older brother Dara Shikoh, but he ordered the governor of Mathura to remove that railing simply because it had been patronized by his brother, who was, of course, seen as an enemy of the state. So here's the same pattern. Anyone who patronizes a temple, if the patron is an enemy of the state, then the temple is going to be in trouble, which is exactly what happened in the case of Aurangzeb, which is also exactly what happened for centuries before in the case of many other temples. But the immediate cause of Aurangzeb's destruction of the Keshavadeva temple was a violent rebellion that took place in the Mathura region by Jats, a large farming community. The Mughals took heavy casualties in suppressing that rebellion, and among those killed was the governor, who was the same governor who had removed the railing to the temple built by the emperor's brother. So you can see how this all is kind of coming together here. In addition to destroying the temple, the emperor ordered the construction of this Eidgah, which is simply a structure for the offering of public Muslim prayers. Coming down to modern times, in 1958, a new Keshavadeva temple was built to the south of the Eidgah. 10 years later, 1968, representatives of both structures reached a compromise that gave each side control over its respective site. But this compromise was undermined as a result of several pivotal events that took place between 1990 and 1992. And I want to spend a little bit of time discussing those in turn. The first of these was a political tour. The BJP, the party that was challenging the Congress party at the time for rule over North India, conducted this spectacular tour, a Rath Yatra, from Somnath in Gujarat all the way across through India to Ayodhya. So here we have an image of the BJP with a bow and arrow, with very significantly the symbols, of course, of Rama in his chariot. his Rata, which is going to be going on this tour. It's actually a Toyota, but the chariot. But there we are, going through the heart of India. In fact, here is a map which shows a little more detail of this. It starts in Gujarat, very importantly, very symbolically. Somnath in Gujarat was the site of a temple, another Shiva temple that was destroyed in the early 11th century by Mahmud of Ghazni, and it was rebuilt several times. There's a long history behind that. In fact, Romola Tupper has an excellent book on this very event, this very temple. But the point is, it achieved national status and significance, especially around the time of independence of India. And the memory of Mahmud Ghazni and the destruction of that temple became extremely important. Anyway, so it starts there and it ends in Ayodhya, and you can see the tour runs right through the center of the Hindi belt, as it were. And after a month and a half, this chariot tour ends up in Ayodhya, the site where Rama was believed to have been born. Now, the problem was that the spot where he was believed to have been born is the very spot where, in the year 1528, the first Mughal emperor, Babur, builds one of several mosques in his brief reign when he founds the Mughal Empire in 1526. And obviously, no Rama Temple can be built, if this is indeed the site where Rama was born, until this mosque has been demolished. So that's the background, part of the background, and the whole movement of that chariot tour that I just described had as its implicit, at least implicit, if not explicit goal, focusing on this spot in Ayodhya as a potential site for a Rama temple, which was seen by the BJP as simply restoring what had been there until it had been demolished and replaced by the Mosque of Babur. One fact. Then we come in 1991, the year after that, the Indian Parliament passed a very important Place of Religious Worship Act, which affirmed the religious identity of any place of worship it could not be changed from what it had already been on August 15, 1947. In other words, at the moment of independence from the British, any mosque that was a mosque at that time would remain a mosque forever. Any temple that was a temple at that time remained a temple. So the act was intended to settle once and for all the status of India's religious monuments. But it actually, ironically, had the opposite effect, in part because it raised people's awareness of the religious character of physical monuments more generally. Moreover, there was one important exception respecting the monuments that were covered by this act, and that was the Babri Masjid, the one we just saw. That mosque was excluded from the act on the grounds that its status as a legitimate mosque had been under litigation at the time that Parliament passed this act. Not only did many Hindus believe that this was the site of Rama's birthplace, but in 1949, right after independence, devotees of Rama had surreptitiously placed idols dedicated to him inside the mosque. So it really stopped being a functioning mosque at all from that moment on. But it certainly was extraordinarily controversial all the way for the next several decades, the status of that site. Indeed, we come down to the third event I wanted to focus on, these three pivotal years from 1990 to 1992. Finally, in late 1992, in this charged atmosphere, especially after the 1990 chariot tour, whose destination had been Ayodhya, a mob destroyed the mosque on December 6th. Here we are on December 6th. Thereafter, now the BJP cranked up its demand that a great Rama temple should be built on the site of this mosque. And of course, as we all know, the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, rose to power in 2014 in large part on the promise that, if elected, he would build such a temple, which of course he did 32 years later. And here it is, of course. We all remember this. This is recent memory now. Just last January 22nd, the construction is completed, and now it's on that day being officially and formally consecrated. So what made this whole thing possible, in large part, was a ruling of India's Supreme Court in 2019, which awarded the land of the destroyed Babri Masjid to Hindus on the basis that many Hindus believed that the god Rama had been born on the site of the destroyed mosque. This astounding decision ignored not only the beliefs of Muslims, but it also ignored facts, since there's no historical or credible archaeological evidence indicating that a Hindu temple had ever existed on this site. Be that as it may, we have seen since in the last several months, several years, several implications of these events. And I'm going to close with these implications. One of them is that Modi's patronizing this new temple, this new Rama temple, has intentionally or unintentionally tapped into that ancient notion dating all the way back to the 5th century that a king must patronize the god understood as the cosmic overlord of his kingdom, and that to do so, he must first build an elaborate royal temple housing the image of that cosmic overlord. Owing to centuries of Islamic rule across most of medieval India, that idea had largely disappeared by the 16th century, although it did remain dormant. And for many decades after independence in 47, India fostered the idea of a secular government presiding over a multicultural nation. But for years, and especially after the Chariot tour of 1990, the BJP party has presided over the collection of individual bricks that would come from thousands of individual villages across India. The idea being that each one of those bricks would be part of this soon to be built, hoped to be built, temple to Rama. Now the fact that the bricks themselves come from, in theory, each and every village of the whole state really makes this place architecturally into something of a national temple, which I find fascinating because of the way in which it reverberates and has echoes with this long, long, deeper history of political theology. Modi seems to identify this particular temple with the Indian nation, as you see here in this model, where he actually says, Ram se Rashtra, from Rama to the nation. And this association is seen in many other ways. Modi also has abandoned any notion that the head of state is above or beyond religion. To the contrary, he cultivates the persona of an Indian sadhu, or a holy man, who renounces worldly life. He also associates his own personal religiosity with the Indian nation by wearing Vaishnava markings on the forehead and adorning himself with the colors of the Indian flag. Like his BJP predecessors, he associates himself primarily with one deity, Rama, which of course is depicted in the background with his quiver and bow and arrows. And although the consecration of the Rama temple last January was performed by Brahmin priests, Modi played the role of the traditional king, propitiating the image of the kingdom's deity. In classical Indian thought, kings are associated with blood and killing, and as such, they are ritually unqualified, disqualified from interacting directly with the deity. Instead, they must do so mediated by a Brahmin priest. We see this relationship dramatically depicted in this 12th century bas-relief, where we have, in this case, we're back in Orissa. The deity Jagannath is on the left. The king is on the right. obviously you see the sword strapped on his left side, and the Brahmin priest, who for reasons I don't know doesn't have a head, but doesn't matter. But he does have the sacred thread. And the point being that the king does not interact directly with the deity. All he can do is patronize the Brahmins, and it is the Brahmins who have that ritual capacity and ritual job. And what's fascinating is that when we come to last January, we see Modi depicted here in precisely the same relationship to the newly unveiled image of Rama in Ayodhya. So I think these images speak to that kind of connection with the past, with the deep past indeed, in the relationship between king, Brahmin, and deity, which is dramatically acted out in last January. Hinduism, of course, as we all know, is a very pluralist religion with many, many gods besides Rama. So the whole idea of making a de facto state cult out of one deity runs against the grain of thousands of years of Indian history. Yet the idea of a national cult does have great appeal, including for overseas Indians. The temple's consecration was displayed, you see here, in Times Square. This is Times Square, January 22, where we have the temple. It's all associated, of course, with the Indian flag, with Rama on the left. It's all kind of brought together. So that's one implication that I wanted to come to here, is the way in which an archaic idea, an archaic political theology has been effectively revived and enacted, dramatically so in the case of the events of just this year. The second point and the final point I want to mention today, the other implication has to do with what all this means for other Muslim structures in South Asia. And especially what the ruling, the 2019 Supreme Court ruling, what that might have to do with all of this. Recall that the 1991 Places of Worship Act was intended to prevent any move to change the religious status of monuments as of 1947. But ironically, as I already mentioned, that act had the opposite effect, namely agitation to restore any given religious structure to an imagined original state. Encouraging all of this was the 2019 Supreme Court decision that awarded the Babri Masjid, the site of the Babri Masjid, to Hindus on the basis of the beliefs of some Hindus. That, in turn, opened the door for anybody to go to any court of law and contest the original identity of any Islamic structure. So, in Mathura, Hindus are now claiming jurisdiction over the entire site that had been divided between the Keshavadeva Temple and the Shahi Eidgah. They've taken the matter to the courts, challenging the legitimacy not only of the 1968 agreement that had divided the jurisdiction of the site, but they also are contesting the 1991 Places of Worship Act itself. Even the Taj Mahal is vulnerable to such thinking. In 2017, a government tourism brochure omitted any mention that the Taj Mahal even existed. According to the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, the Taj did not, quote, reflect Indian culture. Right-wing groups and revisionist historians have even claimed that it was once a Hindu Shiva temple named Tejo Mahalaya, which got corrupted into the word Taj Mahal. Lawyers in Agra have even petitioned courts to have it declared a Hindu temple. Of course, the Taj will inevitably get off the hook. But less famous sites have not been so lucky. Exactly 1 week after Modi consecrated the great Rama Temple in Ayodhya in January, the Indian government authorities demolished this 14th century mosque in South Delhi. Here we see what it looked like on January 30th. And the rationale was that this mosque had been illegally encroaching on forest land. Of course, it was built in the 14th century, so 700 years earlier. So at this point, at the conclusion of this talk today, I think it might be useful to reflect on how the great 16th century poet Kabir might have responded to all this uproar. Kabir, as many of you, of course, know, was unsparing in dismissing the value of rites and practices of any and all organized religion, in particular Hinduism and Islam. Brother, he asked, where did your two gods come from? Tell me, who made you mad? Rama, Allah, Keshav, Karim, Hari, Hazrat? So many names, so many ornaments, all one gold. Ironically, Kabir was not only a native of Benares, but he worked his trade as a weaver just 1 mile from the disputed Vishnavath temple, Gyanvapi Mosque. So it is fitting, I think, that Kabir should have the last word today. Does Khoda, that is God, does Khoda live in a mosque? Then who lives everywhere? Is Rama in idols and holy ground? Have you looked and found him there? Hari Ram in the east, Allah in the west, so you like to dream. Search in your heart, and in the heart alone, there live Ram and Karim. Thank you very much.